Thank you for the introduction, Nancy. I really appreciate it. I have to say that as I was sitting there watching all the names pop up and the titles coming up, that how intimidating, but for me, little old me, but how incredible that there are so many of you that are interested in learning about this or already have a pretty good idea what's going on, but needs some tools to be more specific as you guys are dealing with this particular topic. So thank you, Nancy, for um, allowing me to share some of the research that's out there, some of the things that I have learned along the way. Let me tell you a little bit about what brought me to this point. Because there's a lot of names on here that I don't recognize. So I'm sure there's many of you that have probably sat in on other trainings that I've done, but there's quite a few of you that I don't recognize, and that thrills me more than you can know, because my passion is for advocating for these particular children. I'm just one voice. It takes all of us to do this. When I started this job about 8 years ago with the School of Medicine, I stepped into the realm of drug endangered children, kind of fell into it by accident, even though on a personal level, we were living it with one of our sons and his child, who we now have guardianship of, and we co-parent well together. Our son is doing well as a peer specialist, and that's a whole nother story. But when I stepped into this particular seminar eight-ish years ago, I sat there with tears streaming down my face because I recognized what we were missing when it comes to dealing with children, especially children who are living in this situation of being drug endangered. Today, our focus is going to be primarily on the family sex trafficking and the intersection between the two. I am going to lay some groundwork for that because I think it's important for us to understand why we're talking about this, where the connections are coming from with the drug endangered part of it. So please humor me, as some of you might have already heard pieces of this. We're going to breeze through the drug endangered part of it and then really hone in on the family sex trafficking. And just know that over these 8 years that I have been working very directly, very specifically in this particular arena, this is something that I've actually been familiar with for about the last 30 years when I started working in my other lifetime. Um, am also a certified doula as well as a childbirth educator and a lactation consultant, where I worked with teen moms. And this is really where this started to fester. That's where the seed was planted back then. Even though I wasn't quite sure what I was seeing at that point, I suspected it. And now we've kind of come full circle, and here I am for the last 6, 7 years, really honing in on this, and this is where the bulk of my work has been. So let's get going on this. Let's jump in with both feet, assuming my, okay, I'm gonna have to stop sharing and I'm gonna go back and do this a different way. So hang on here. Let's try it this way. And we're going to do this. Oops. There we go. We're there. I promise. Okay. So I like to start this with saying, I don't know, I see some of you work for IDOC, some of you are juvenile justice, some are DCFS, so we've got a wide spread here, and that is awesome because that's exactly the way it's supposed to be. And I talk with my hands, so there's no way that I can't not do that on the screen. If you hear me in person, I'm just all over the board, but I'm still going to be all over the board while we're on the screen here. The fact that there are folks that are representing not only children but adults tells me that you are recognizing that what we're seeing in many of our adults is something that stems from trauma from way back when. So I always go to this little quote by Desmond Tutu, and I tell that story of a man walking along the side of the river, and he sees people that have fallen in the river and they're drowning, and he's pulling them out one by one. He's pulling them out. And he keeps pulling them out, and the river starts to get clogged because he's still trying to pull them out and get them help. And finally, he says to himself, you know what? Maybe just pulling them out right here in the river is not the answer. Maybe the logical thing to do is to go upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place. That's what we're going to do today, whether these are children or whether these are adults that you have suspected that there have been issues, it's all going to connect. And what we're going to do is go upstream and look at one of the reasons, one of the very specific reasons that we see so many people actually falling in the first place. The first thing I want to do is define what a drug-endangered child is. And I know some of you are going, what? We do. Well, I know what a drug-endangered child is, but there's a lot of definitions. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So we know that these are children that are suffering several different types of harm, whether it's physical or emotional, as a result of the fact that their parents or caregivers, the home that they're living in, are dealing with drugs. Now, dealing with drugs could mean just possessing them, it could mean using them, it could be manufacturing. So when we think of that, we're thinking of pill presses, racking up the baggies, that kind of thing. Cultivating, and in that we're directly targeting marijuana, even though it is legal in the state of Illinois, and there are some wonderful uses for it, but it still puts our children at danger, or in danger in multiple ways. Or it could be distribution, it could be dealing these drugs. This could be legal drugs, these could be pain pills that folks legally have possession of. Or it could be illegal drugs, the meth and the coke and the heroin and all of that kind of stuff. But what we know overall is that a child that's living in that particular home is not in a safe situation because those caregivers eventually, all of this use and distributing and possessing and all that things of the drugs, it's going to get in the way of their ability to really provide that safe environment for that child. Now, I realize that there are functional drug users. I do. I completely recognize that. Eventually, it becomes not so functional. And for the most part, most people maybe aren't so functional as parents when they are using or they're involved in this kind of stuff. So for just a simple in the box definition, this is what we're going to use, knowing that these children are put into a compromising position in terms of the caregiver's ability to actually parent and provide that safe environment. Now, real quick breeze through. Usually when I talk drug endangered children, I go into a very deep review of what the definition of addiction is. And once again, I have people go, why are you doing that? We're all here because we know. However, not everybody knows the medical definition. This one is put out by the National Institutes for Drug Abuse, and I really like the way that it is set up. Again, I want us all on the same page, kind of thinking in the same direction, so that we know the definition of addiction encompasses four main components. It is chronic, it is relapsing, it is a complex brain disorder, and it is considered a mental illness. And I would add to that most often somebody that is dealing with substance use disorder is also dealing with a co-occurring disorder of mental illness, some type of mental illness. So not only is the substance use disorder, the SUD, a mental illness in and of itself, there is generally speaking a co-occurring disorder of another type of mental illness, another diagnosis that goes with this. Why is this important? Well, if we know that addiction is chronic, that means that it's always going to be in the back of their mind somewhere. It may not be in the forefront, but if you think about it, somebody who's in recovery for alcohol is going to be very careful. I can't walk into that bar. That's not a good place for me. That's a trigger. For somebody that is a meth user, there's certain places in town that they know that they can't drive down that street or they can't walk into that house or hang out with that person. That's what we mean when we say that it is chronic and that it never quite goes away. They constantly have to be on their guard, oftentimes for the duration of their life. You know, even if you've been in recovery successfully for 20 years, I still have people that say, I can't be there. I can't do that. I can't be next to that person. It's too difficult for me. We know that it's relapsing. Numbers, the research tells us, I've seen numbers as low as 40% of folks relapse. I have seen numbers as high as 80% of folks relapse. It depends on what professional journal, what professional article that you are looking at. However, I am going to tend, this is just my personal experience and all the years that I've worked with folks in recovery, I will tell you that all of them, 100%, have relapsed at least once. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Relapse means healing in my eyes. It means learning the process of what works for you in terms of recovery, but it's still a component of addiction according to the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. We know that the drive, research tells us that the drive for drugs is so strong, that compulsive drug seeking, that we know people will go after the drugs even though they might go to jail, they might lose their kids, lose their driver's license, lose their job. We know that, and that's why we call it a relapsing disorder. It is also the number third component is a complex brain disorder. That means multiple parts of the brain are involved, not just one. Makes it very, very difficult from a medical standpoint for us to treat this. Now, opioid use disorder, of course, we have some decent drugs for that, but those drugs don't work for everybody, just like when we look at mental illness and we look at somebody that has severe depression or anxiety, not all drugs work for the same people. A complex brain disorder means we're kind of doing the whack-a-mole thing, trying to figure out what's going to work for addiction. If we had the answers, I guarantee that we would have had a Suboxone for meth. There are some off-label things that folks use for meth. I've seen counselors using for meth. But when we're talking about this, we're looking at something comparable, say, to Suboxone for opioid use disorder. And we don't have that for cocaine. We don't have that for meth. We don't have that for bath salts or kratom or any of those things. Complex brain disorder. We don't know what's quite going on here. We also know that this is a diagnosable mental illness. So for those of you that work with your 708 boards trying to get money to help with addiction, that's your go-to. Addiction is considered a mental illness. But we also know, as I said, co-occurring mental illness diagnoses of anxiety, PTSD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, and how difficult it is for us to, as medical providers, to be able to, and I am not a doctor, I'm not a medical provider, but I know how difficult it is as I work with these docs day in and day out to find a medication that works well. We often don't get it right on the first try. It's not like treating strep. So where we give you penicillin and all is good. It may take several tries. So this whole picture of addiction, as we've just described it, I want you to think about the children that are living in those situations where addiction is present with their caregivers or their parents. Children are not going to be the initial concern. Children are often the first ones that are affected by their caregiver's addiction, but they are most often the last ones to get the help. And that's partly why we're here, is to raise that awareness and help us to understand what's going on in these kids' lives, what are they manifesting, and what do we need to do about it? What can we do about it? How many kids are we talking about? We're talking about 1 in 4. This number just came in May of 2025 through the Journal of the American Medical Association. 1 in 4 children are living with at least one parent or caregiver that meets the criteria for substance use disorder or addiction. Now, these are also children whose parents or the caregiver meet the criteria for moderate to severe substance use disorder. So we're still leaving out more the children on the lower end of that scale in terms of danger. This is big stuff. And by the way, I am going to just let you guys know, as I always do, I am going to use the term substance use disorder, substance misuse, and addiction. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. And I realize that for some folks that might be offensive, and that is not what I mean to do at all. My folks, oftentimes in recovery that I work with, don't like it when I use the term SUD or substance misuse. They prefer the term addiction. They say, Miss Liesl, just use it like it's meant, that just tell it like it is. My professionals typically prefer SUD and substance misuse. So rather than pick one or the other, I'm just going to, as I always tell people, I'm just going to offend everybody all the same. And I mean that tongue in cheek. Please, please don't take it that way. But just understand I am using those terms interchangeably for a reason. And that's the reason that I do that. But this number, this 1 in 4, is astounding. This is finally what teachers have known that they've been seeing in the classroom, what counselors, pediatric counselors in particular, have known for years. This is what we're seeing, 1 in 4 kids. So in a classroom of 20 kids, 5 that we know of, these are just the ones we know of, are dealing with the trauma of addiction at home with their parents. Now, what goes on with these kids? They're more likely to be physically and sexually abused. We're going to talk about the sexual abuse, some of that, a specific type. These kids are more likely to be neglected. Neglect is a key word here because this is where these kids show up in our system. They don't show up often, or at least at the earliest points, with a pregnancy at 11 or 12 years old or an STI. Typically, where the reports come in is through neglect. And I'm going to highlight, I saw a whole bunch of people from DCFS on this program today. And I think that that neglect piece is something that we really need to have high priority in our mind. And I'm going to go through the legal definition of neglect here in just a second. We also know that these kids are more likely to develop substance use disorder themselves as they get older. And a lot of that is just their way. Yes, it's learned, but it is also their way of stemming the trauma of what they've lived through. So let's define neglect just so we know as we're moving forward, because this also shows up on the side of family sex trafficking, which we're going to talk about. In Illinois, the legal definition of neglect is the failure of a parent or a caregiver to meet minimal parenting standards. So that means minimally providing adequate supervision, food, clothing, medical care, shelter, or other basic needs. That's kind of a scary proposition. And I want to take a moment to give a shout out to our DCFS folks that are on here, because you guys are working within boundaries that are almost a no-win situation. So those of us who make the reports and we know that there's a problem in the home and we make that report, we need to remember that when that caseworker goes into the home and looks at the situation, all that has to be shown, all those parents have to show, is that they are providing minimal parenting standards. That's it. We really, really, really need to be mindful of that when we are talking to DCFS and we're working with those caregivers or those caseworkers. In many cases, their hands are tied with what they can do. I will give one quick example. A recent example, a daycare provider called me and had 3 little girls, all under the age of 4, that had from birth, all of these little girls had been removed from the home. Mom did well eventually and ultimately went through the rehab, went through the programs, got her girls back. And the same daycare provider was used when the girls were in foster care and then also when mom got the girls back. And within a few weeks of mom having the little girls back, the the daycare provider started to notice the girls were coming in the same clothes every single day, same underwear. For the littlest ones, the two littlest ones, the daycare provider would mark the diaper where they'd put a clean diaper on before they'd send them home, and that child would come back the next morning in the same diaper, completely soiled, messy, awful. So daycare provider made the report, and I'm going to shorten this story just a little bit, but the caseworker did go to the home and took a look at things. The other gripe or the other complaint, I guess I shouldn't use the word gripe, the other complaint was that the little girls were getting in the trash. They were starving to death. They were just so hungry. They were losing weight. And the caseworker went into the home and basically said, all of these minimal parenting standards were being met. The girls weren't running wild, out of the apartment. There was food in the home. They had clothes on. They weren't clean, but they had clothes on. Their shots were up to date, all the basic things. And the case was closed. And that was very, very, very frustrating to that daycare provider until I showed them the minimal parenting standards. And what this does is allows us to help our investigators. When we understand what that minimal parenting standard is, it helps us to know what we need to be documenting and actually reporting and helping them build the case when we know that there's really a problem in that home. So I'm going to leave it at that. I could do an entire session on that one, but I'm going to leave that sitting there for a minute. And I want you to keep that in your mind as we are moving through all of this. Now, we know that a report of child abuse or neglect is made every 10 seconds in the United States. That's a lot of calls per day. We know that these kids who experience this abuse and neglect are more likely to be arrested as a juvenile, as an adult, as well as commit violent crime. 2/3 of the adults in treatment for addiction have reported being abused or neglected as children. 2/3. That's a key number. And that is a huge, huge number of adults. So those of you who are working on the IDOC side of things, now you can begin to connect that trauma. You're beginning to connect some of those dots. Be thinking of that as we go forward. With that being said, we know that 82%, and this is a number from 2022, I would venture to guess it's probably higher. 82% of folks that are living in an addictive situation report that their family history included 2 previous generations worth of that same substance use disorder. So not only is this something that it's a learned technique, we know that. But again, start connecting the dots, the abuse and the neglect, the intergenerational involvement with substance use disorder. And just, I think it was last week that Jerry Moe spoke, last week or the week before, that Jerry Moe, who is a specialist, a retired specialist, sort of the brain between or regarding children in drug-endangered situations. He spoke on the Illinois Family Resource Center webinar just a week or two ago, and he said, these adults are yesterday's children that nobody helped. So we have the opportunity to say, wait a minute, what can we do to prevent this from happening as we go forward, or to at least stem the tide of the trauma that these kids go through? So I've laid the groundwork for drug-endangered children. Let's intersect the family sex trafficking. The same children are at risk. Now, I want to say that not all drug-endangered children are going to be trafficked by their families. It's just not true. It's not going to happen. I could say it 1,000 times and there's still going to be somebody that says, well, that was the implication. It's not the implication. What I'm telling you is that there's a larger number of these kids being trafficked than what we realize. I just did another data review within the last 2 weeks, and there were several quotes that said this topic is very, very, very underreported. We think that this is way worse than what we're seeing. But let's talk about this. Not every child who's living in a drug home is trafficked. Keep that in your mind. But how many are being trafficked by their families? Let's talk a little bit about that, and let's talk about what these children experience when they are in that situation. Because for those of you who work with adults who are dealing with addiction, this may be one of the traumas that they have been through, possibly if they came up through that multi-generational cycle of addiction. And it may be a question that needs to come up in the process so that we can adequately address the issues going on. So what is family sex trafficking? When we think of sex trafficking, we think of a child being snatched out of the Walmart shopping cart. I live in the middle of nowhere, so we have Walmart around here, or Dollar General. They're snatched out and somebody drags them out and runs off with them and we don't see them. And they traffic that child across state lines, wherever. The idea when we're talking about just this very generalized type of sex trafficking is that we want to get those children back to their families, get the healing process going. Family trafficking is different in that we know that this child is being trafficked specifically by their mother, their father, or a caregiver, or another family member, or somebody that that child perceives to be a family member. They're being trafficked typically in the home. Now, they might take that child out to hotels and that kind of thing, but primarily this is done within the home. And the difference is these children are born and raised in that home. Okay, that's a little bit different. One of the other big differences here is that these children can't, if we find out this is going on and we remove that child from the home, we can't put them back in there. So that sets up a whole nother set of aftercare issues. Do they go into foster care? Do we have residential treatment centers for children? And we don't. I mean, we don't have what we need. Let me put it that way. DCFS here in Illinois has just very recently opened a child trafficking residential treatment center up north, and I'm excited to see how that works and what they do with it, because we need these everywhere. This is going on way more than what we realize. Family sex trafficking is a particular type of ugly because these children can't get out of it. And if we remove them from the home, they can't go back to their home. We'll talk about some of those specifics. So keep those things in mind. Let's try connecting some dots here. Children make up almost 70% of all victims in new sex trafficking cases. So that's almost 3/4 of sex trafficking cases are children. 82%, and that's an old piece of data, that's 2021. I would like to see more accurate data points being made, but they're just not always out there. But 82% of family trafficking we know involves an exchange, either an exchange for illegal drugs or exchange for money that is going to fund a drug habit for that family, one of those family members. Those are big numbers. Do you see what I mean when we talk about connecting these dots? I'm throwing a lot at you, but run it through your mind. We know that the majority of trafficking cases that begin, that are happening within the family, those kids are being trafficked mostly by the mother. That is just, research is showing us that over and over and over again. Over half of all, just any trafficking cases start with family members. And then you think about the moms are the ones that are most often the ones doing this, okay? 60% of domestic child trafficking victims have a history with the child welfare system for neglect. That's where they show up. They show up not coming to school. They show up very dirty. They show up falling asleep in class when they do show up for school, or hungry, or hurt, psychosomatic complaints, things that just you can't put your finger on one big thing, but we're looking at several things off of a checklist. Now, kind of keep that in mind, because when you need to make a report, you suspect this, the more items that you can check off and report and give some detail on, the more tools our caseworkers and our investigators have to work with. And that makes that, even though that boundary of minimal parenting standards is pretty well set, the more tools, the more things that we can give them to look into, the more likely it is that they're going to undercover and substantiate, or uncover, not undercover, uncover and substantiate the claims that we're making here. I saw a recent doctoral dissertation, and this is kind of new because this is not an area that I typically delve into, but ran across one doctoral dissertation that said 75% of familial trafficking involves addiction, substance use disorder. That's a lot. We know, we know, but the suspicion, and it's still just very much a suspicion, that family trafficking or familial trafficking may very well be the most common type of trafficking. It is much understood and assumed that it is greatly underestimated. The numbers are underestimated for two reasons. One, very hard to uncover because it's easy to hide it within a family. We'll talk about why that is. It is also underestimated in that, to be honest with you, this is not something that has been talked about a whole heck of a lot until perhaps the most recent 5, 6, 7, 8 years, if you will. So back in my other life, I had a case where I had a young lady. The school nurse called me and said, I've got, I think she was in seventh grade, sixth or seventh grade, 12 years old roughly. And she has turned up 9 months pregnant. And the nurse said I'd been kind of watching things because she was all of a sudden wearing baggy clothes and all of that. And would you come in and do some classes with her because she is going to have this baby within the next couple of weeks and she doesn't even understand how it got in there. Well, in talking with her, we were moving very quickly, had to do it in a very careful way, but we were moving very quickly to speak with this young lady and teach what was coming down the pike. And what ultimately came out is that her brother, her older brother, was trafficking her to his friends within the home. Mom and dad, loving home, wonderful loving home. Mom and dad loved their kids, but mom and dad both worked nights in a local factory in a very rural area. They lived in a very rural area. Brother was involved with drugs and saw an opportunity to make some money, be able to buy more drugs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what came out of it is that this young lady was trafficked by her brother. And it was something that nobody saw coming. That was really my first true exposure to what was going on behind those closed doors. Nobody would have seen that coming with that particular family, but it has all the hallmarks, as you'll see, of family sex trafficking and all the things that had somebody maybe had a checklist, we might have been able to make a report. What we know about these kids that are trafficked by their families, they are typically much younger than other types of trafficking victims. And the simple reason is that they grow up in this home. They are groomed from day one for this purpose, oftentimes. Now, with that being said, the youngest case that I have ever had was a set of 6-month-old twins that I became privy to and working with the family on that. And again, these children were born into this home. This was the way of it. And so what that does is it sets up the scenario that these children are also exploited for much longer periods of time because the adults have access to them and they have a specialized access to them. They can control them. They're the ones that are providing their food. If you're 4 years old, you can't run away and start couch surfing on your friends' couches like you might be able to do when you're 15. A 3-year-old can't run, or a 4-year-old can't run. So these kids are typically exploited for much longer periods of time at much younger ages than what we think of with maybe a 13-year-old who gets online and meets up with somebody that they think is legitimately going to love them, and they run off and they meet them and then they get taken away. Um, this is different. This is different. As I said, these kids are groomed from the very earliest age, and they are dependent on these parents or these caregivers for their basic needs. And what that does is that sets up children who then grow up to be adults who almost don't realize that this is wrong. So it's normalized. It becomes very normalized. It's the way their family works. It's accepted in their family culture. There's a couple of points here I want to make to that. That family culture piece, we know that oftentimes this is an intergenerational activity, if that makes sense. So this is the way mom did it. This is the way grandma did it. This is just what we do. And so in that child's world, which starts from the moment they're born, that they're raised into, they just assume this is the way we do things. Okay? It's just the way we do things. The other piece to this normalization, I have people say, well, when they become an adult, surely they're going to realize that's not a good thing. It's a bad thing to do this. Don't assume that. Please don't assume that. So I'm speaking very strongly to my folks on here who are working with adults who have grown up in a drug-endangered home. It may be well worth the question explaining what family sex trafficking is and find a way to ask if this was a part of their life. I have a sweet friend who has been in recovery for a very long time now. Her life was horrendous. Mom and dad both did drugs. And she finally left home at 13, hooked up with some guy, had a couple of kids, ended up in prison several times over, crisscrossing the United States. Somewhere in all of this, she managed to finish her high school diploma. She got a bachelor's degree, and she got a master's degree out of this. Somewhere in all of this, she got a master's degree in business. She is now very successful. She has been in long-term recovery for quite a while now. And I had her come speak on a panel when I was speaking at a state conference, and had a panel of folks that that have been in recovery, because it's another topic that I work with. And she heard me talk about this particular topic, and she never said anything to me about it. I had never heard anything more than just this rough part of her story of, her life growing up and so on and so forth. Well, a couple of months later, she asked me to come sit in on she was going to tell her story. And she said, would you come and just be there for support? I said, sure. And I was a little confused because she's told her story a million times over, and I didn't understand why this time was going to be different. It was very different, because as she was telling her story, the tears started coursing down her face, and she said, and I need to tell you that Liesl explained to me what family sex trafficking is, and that happened to me. That's what was going on in my home until I ran away at 13 years old. This was going on. I was raised to believe that this is what we did. This is how we did this. I knew I didn't like it, but I honestly don't think I knew that it was wrong. This woman is in her mid-40s, well educated, well recovered, and still had that in her history, in her mind. So please, please don't assume that just because you're working with an adult that is out in the world and has been out in the world, that they might come to the conclusion that, oh gosh, that was wrong. That shouldn't have happened to me. It doesn't work that way. Our brains don't work that way. When you're groomed and you're raised to think that this is the way it happens, or this is the way we do it in our family, it truly becomes embedded in their person. But deep down inside, there's something, this was painful, this is horrible. And so now this young woman is now starting to deal with what I in my eyes might very well be her final trauma of, she's dealt with so many of the other pieces. This is something that is now she's looking back going, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. And I will tell you that yes, she had her children taken from her over the years, but she told me she would never have trafficked her children. She said, "Oh my goodness, I didn't like it. I wasn't going to do it to my kids." So sometimes, yes, it is handed down intergenerationally. Sometimes the buck stops here. And in her case, it did. So there's a lot of moving parts here, but I wanted you to hear that. These kids are raised to say, we just don't talk about this. You don't talk about this. You don't ask any questions. You don't let anybody ask you any questions, and you don't tell them anything. So when we talk to kids that have been involved in this situation, or we suspect they are, they may very well not tell you anything. They've been raised to not talk about it. As children get a little bit older and they hit that teenage years and all the sexual exploration and all the pieces that go with that, sometimes then they may start to recognize that this is not normal or this is not a good thing. And that's where the shame comes in and the guilt. Now, shame and guilt can start way earlier than that, but that's where I hear usually around that junior high school age that shame and that guilt really starts to be more likely to be verbalized. Not always. Again, a lot of moving parts here, but just giving you guys some pieces that may come into play. And then these kids oftentimes will pop up with some what we call psychosomatic complaints, headaches and tummy aches and pain, body pain and sleep issues and all those things that it's really hard to put our finger on. And doctors, maybe the pediatricians may be looking at this, or the e-room may be looking, or convenient care, and they really can't find anything. But I think it's a red flag if a child is continually being brought in for these kinds of things. I think it's worth asking the questions, doing the explanation and asking those questions. These kids are less likely to run away. One thing is fear, but as I said too, where's a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or even an 8-year-old going to go? They might try to run away, but they very quickly are put in their place not to. We tend to see those kids maybe trying to run away as they get older. They hit those early teenage years where maybe they can do some couch surfing. And so there, that sets us up into the whole McKinney-Vento thing of our homeless school children. Is this a question we're asking? Why are these children running away? Why are they homeless? Why are they couch surfing? It's something we need to be asking. We know that these victims are less likely to have substance abuse issues as children, as young children. What we're starting to see is in junior high and high school, these kids are reaching for drugs to stem the pain of the trauma. They have access to it. It's much easier. And to be honest with you, it works. It causes them to not have to think about it, to forget about it. But more than likely, as younger children, they're not going to turn up with addiction issues as a 7-year-old. They miss a lot of school, quite frankly, because that they may be working. They may be working through the night. And if your job didn't stop, your trafficker didn't, brought in all the clients, the customers, if you will, the perpetrators, didn't stop bringing them in till 2 or 3 in the morning, and then mom or dad takes the money that you have made that they have made off of you, and they go buy drugs, and then they come back and they use those drugs. By the time the alarm goes off at 7 o'clock to get up for school and get on the bus, everybody's out. The parents are knotted out, the child is exhausted, and so they miss a lot of school. They also, those go back to those somatic complaints. Parents don't want to send their kid to school if that child is sick and somebody might have extra eyes on the situation. On the other hand, we have parents that don't really care and send those kids to school sick. So, or not feeling good, or they've got that headache and that tummy ache and those things that we can't quite lean into, we can't figure out. So school nurses, if they're, and teachers, as they are seeing that same child come in for that same thing and nothing is coming of it, we might want to be asking these questions and looking at some of these other things. Again, I've said it several times, the initial point of contact with child welfare is generally for neglect. So if we're going to get to these kids at the earliest point possible, this might be our earliest point, which makes the case for knowing how to make a good report to DCFS. And I would tell you, in your communities, go talk to your investigators, go talk to your DCFS investigators and ask them, what do I need? What are you looking for? What do I need to make a good report? I'm giving you generalizations here, but the more information you can give them, the more things they're going to be able to look at. So let's look for those neglect pieces. And when I say lack of detection by child welfare, I say that because they can only investigate what they know to investigate. So we need to be giving them as many tools as possible to look at things. These kids, we're seeing higher and higher rates of suicide with our younger and younger children. We know that kids who have been trafficked have much higher rates of suicide attempts. And I will tell you that it's younger and younger kids. So some of the preliminary things you might see with this is kids that are performing self-harm, the cutting. I want to know what's going on with that. And when I have a school resource officer that will call me and say, I've got this situation, something has changed with this child. All of a sudden we're cutting, we're wearing dark clothes, we don't smell good, they're very isolated, detached. I'm going to ask what has changed in the home? Has something changed in the home? And it would not be uncommon for that to happen. A scenario might be mom and dad have divorced. The child is living with mom. I'm going to pick on mom. Child is living with mom, and mom has a new boyfriend who sees an opportunity to pay for the drug habit. Just a thought. So just triggering some questions maybe to ask. These kids have complex trauma. So many pieces. They want to leave home, but they don't even know maybe that that's an option or not, or how to make it an option. They've been told don't tell, but hey, this hurts and I don't like this and I feel yucky and I'm depressed and my anxiety is through and kids don't verbalize those things. They don't know how to verbalize it if they haven't been taught the words to do so. The complex trauma that comes from this, these are their parents. These are their caregivers, the people that are supposed to love them dearly and take care of them. And they provide them their food and they provide them a place to sleep and they provide their clothes. They do all of those things. And yet they're also manipulated from both a physical standpoint and an emotional standpoint. And I want to delve into that a little bit more, that it causes all kinds of spaces that they don't know how to deal with and they don't even realize it's going on. But as educators, as investigators, as mandated reporters, if we see something like this and we start check marking some of these boxes, maybe this is a question we need to be asking. Remember, not all drug-endangered children are trafficked by their families, but we've seen data that shows us maybe it's higher than what we realize it might be. These kids have severe attachment issues. It is very confusing to love a parent who hurts you desperately. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Those attachment issues are a big deal and will go with them throughout their life. So on the adult side of things, I hear probation officers, I hear drug court officers, judges tell me, well, they won't even look me in the eye. They don't, they're not going to tell me their story. They're afraid of the law. They've been taught you hate the law. We're not going to do this. And it takes a long time to break through some of those bonds. And many of them can be traced back to not only the complex trauma, but also the attachment issues. And so until we deal with those things, we're really not going to move forward to help them. They're not going to get what they need. How do the caregivers or the traffickers gain compliance from these children? Well, there's just a few basic things. If you're 5 years old and you like to have a McDonald's Happy Meal once in a while, bingo. This is how dad's going to say, you're going to do some work tonight, and if you do that, then I'll go get you a Happy Meal and you'll have supper. Or it could be, we'll go to the fair tomorrow night. If you work tonight and tomorrow night, we'll have enough money that we can go to the fair. We can do this. So promise of rewards. Punishment is big. It's not uncommon for these children to be beaten into submission. So if you are you're working directly with children, you may see wrist marks where they've been tied down. You might see the typical bruising. If a child, comes in and can't sit still, and you suspect that something's been going on and they can't sit still, maybe their bottom hurts. There's physical abuse there, from whether they're being beaten or whether they're being sexually assaulted. It may also mean punishment in the form of I'm going to kill the dog if you don't do this the way that I want you to do it. Those caregivers will tell them that. Or it could be the perpetrator that is saying, get in that position or your cat's going to go missing, or your little brother's going to go missing. So it is a punishment. They may use punishment as a coercive measure here. There's also that issue of implied obligation or guilt. They guilt them into it. If you don't do this, if you don't meet with my friends tonight and do what they want you to do, you and your brothers and sisters aren't going to eat. Nobody eats. We're not going to have food tonight. Or it might be, I need to buy mom her medicine, and mom's not going to get her medicine. And if mom doesn't get her medicine, you know that she's going to get angry and it gets ugly. And they live in that hell of an environment that sometimes it's easier just to give in, and they know that. The last part in terms of compliance I want you to think about is, how many times do we, as healthy parents, if you want to put it this way, look at our kids and say, you need to eat the peas on your plate. And I hated peas as a child, hated them. You need to eat those peas because I'm the mom and I said so. You have to clean your room because I am the dad and I said so. Parental authority, when you are especially a young child, now teenagers are going to push the issue, even school-age children, but the point is, these are your parents and they're telling you, you have to do this. These are your caregivers. If you're in foster care and it just happens to be one of those horrendous foster care situations, obviously not all of them are. I know wonderful, wonderful angels of foster parents, tons of them. But there's that one in a million. And that foster parent is saying, I will call your caseworker and this and this and this is going to happen. I'm the boss. You have to do this. Parental authority is huge, carries a lot more weight than we realize. So we know that these are children. They can't just leave. They can't just run away. If they run away, the police are going to find them and the parents are going to go, oh my goodness, they ran right out the door and I couldn't catch them. And they're going to bring them right back into that situation. Law enforcement, that's what we do. That's what they do. We bring them right back in. And that caregiver then can use, we've talked about some of the threats. We've talked about the bribing. We've talked about the intimidation, the physical force, tying them down to the floor or the bed or in a position, whatever. They isolate. These are the kids that don't get to go to the birthday parties. These are the kids that don't maybe have good friends at school. Or here's those moving pieces again. I'm going to throw out the caveat that some of these kids come to school and do quite well because that is their safe space. They can thrive in that situation, and they've been taught to be adult pleasers. So you go to school and you please the adult and you make good grades. So they may not be completely isolated. They may not be. So you have to start looking for these other pieces. But isolation is often a tool that is used. The emotional abuse, you have to do this because I said so. If you don't do this, I'll beat you. It might be that you are so ugly, this is the only way that anybody is ever going to love you. You have is in this way with this activity. Not uncommon for weapons to be used. Um, you wave a gun in front of a child and it's probably going to scare the living daylights out of them. And they're going to do what you want them to do if you hold a gun to their head. But parental authority overall in all of this is where the maintenance of that child victim lies. Is when they're living in that this setup, this psychological setup is so deeply ingrained, it leads to the complex trauma, it leads to the attachment issues, it leads to all of it. So now, as you're thinking that through, think through if you are somebody that deals with adults. I've got a hair in my eye. If you deal with adults, is this maybe part of the background? If you've got children that you're dealing with or young people, teenagers, and you're seeing some of your maybe starting to connect some of the dots, possibly. Again, it's not every drug endangered child, but it is a good number of them. Okay, here are the red flags, and we've talked through a lot of this stuff already. Child welfare involvement for neglect, excessive absences from school. So these are the kids that are in truancy issue. Um, that's definitely a good place to be asking questions. They're showing up to the emergency room, doctor visits for things that nobody can pinpoint. Absolutely nobody can pinpoint. If the parents are taking them to the doctor, many times they won't. But this might be where it shows up. And where do these kids, where do the reports, the substantiated reports normally come from? Usually it's going to be medical personnel or school personnel. Just throwing that little bit of information out. If you see a child that just slowly over time changes in mood or behavior or appearance, that's probably a red flag. Something's going on. If they're trying to run away from home and you hear about it, you may or may not. But if a child is, if a 7-year-old is found to be running away from home or leaving and having to be brought back, why do they want to run from home? What's going on? We need to be asking those questions. Of course, if a child shows up with a sexually transmitted infection, never for any reason should a child have an STI. That is an automatic report right there, and that is probably the biggest red flag. And I will tell you, I was just looking at some new information actually just before we got on, some reports that lived experience reports from folks that are now adults that had written some things on there. And the one young person said that they had spent 12 years after they had gotten out of that family sex trafficking situation. They had spent 12 years with multiple surgeries and repairing types of healing processes to stem the tide of the damage to their body. This was a young lady. And so you can imagine a grown man having sex with a 4-year-old girl over and over and over again. Think about the physical damage that is done internally, let alone externally. So that's where that's going. Suicide, big red flag. If we've got children that are wanting to commit suicide or attempting to commit suicide or self-harm, and I know that self-harm is not always the precursor to suicide, but oftentimes it is a cry for help that something is going on. And that mutilation of the body, that making myself ugly, might keep those people away. That's kind of where a child's mind works. So think about that. PTSD, this is very, very real. Those of you who are not only dealing with children, but dealing with the adults on the PTSD side of it, this is worth exploring with your folks with PTSD that doesn't maybe have another known etiology. And then multi-generational substance use disorder. Go back to those early statistics. 2/3 of the people in addiction recovery, substance use disorder recovery, were abused or neglected as children. 82% of folks that are in addiction can say, I've had the past 2 generations have also been involved in this. Let's take a look at those things and start looking closer. These kids are very tired. They can't keep up with school, or they may incredibly excel because that's their safe space, but you might see other pieces that are of concern. And in that case, when I look at that side of things, I always say this incredible need to please adults, just bending over backwards to please an adult. If I've got other concerns going on, I've check marked some other boxes. Those might be questions we might ask. The child might be isolated and doesn't socialize with other kids. We've talked about poor hygiene. They're nervous. They're anxious. They're very fearful of adults. Not always. We might have that one exception of that child that is kind of the overachiever because they're in a safe space, but more often we're going to see this. The kids will give very vague answers when you ask pointed questions. So you might have to slide in with those questions in a different way. And it may be over time. As kids build trust in you, they might be more willing to share some of those things, and those answers might not be so vague, or you might build into being able to ask questions that are more pointed. These kids have poor mental health. They're very protective of the parent or caregiver because, mind you, that's who's feeding them. That's whose home they're living in. They've been taught to love these people, and they're going to be very protective of that parent or caregiver. They may also be in a position where they have had to be the parent to the siblings or to the parent, while that parent is, if they've used their drugs and say they've overdosed. This might be the kid that gives the Narcan to bring them back from the overdose. They're going to be very protective of those parents or caregivers because many times that's the love that they know, and they will tell you they love their mom and dad. These kids have a lack of understanding regarding sexual abuse, and the big thing people say is, well, we have sex abuse preventive measures. We have the lady comes in and talks to us about this at the school once a year. Yes, they do, but I guarantee that lady or that man, that educator, is not talking specifically about family trafficking. Our programs don't address that. When we start to address that, and I have taught some people call it body safety, some people call it good touch, bad touch, whatever you want to call it, in the schools. And when we address this very specifically, it's amazing the kids that will disclose, that will come up for air and think, oh my goodness, that's happening to me. And that woman up there just said that's wrong, and that I need to tell my one trusted adult. So, lack of understanding, we need to make sure we're building that into our programming. Some of the other physical issues, we've talked about some of it. Bruising in the mouth or the throat due to oral sex. So often we'll see dental issues because of that also. And in the perpetrator's mind, not only is it feels good to them, supposedly, but they also think, oh, I'm not assaulting them. In their sick way of thinking, I'm not hurting that kid. I'm not hurting that kid. So bruising in the mouth or the throat, that's continual. It's always there. That child might find it hard to swallow, to eat, and that's an on and on thing. They might have pain in the genital area, which would be very, very, very common. And I will tell you, with our little boys that are in those situations, of course, we're looking at anal pain. With our little girls, it's both anal and vaginal. Wrist and ankle pain from being tied down, bleeding. So not only anal and vaginal bleeding or pain, but also bleeding. And that's another reason those kids might not come to school. They might be going to miss school if somebody in the home recognizes that they're bleeding. Asthma is a complication for the oral sex piece of it for these kids. Throat and urinary tract infections for obvious reasons. Throat for oral sex, urinary tract for vaginal sex. Just throwing those things out there, okay? There's some of your checklist pieces. We know that when trauma starts within the family, that children will adapt their behavior to survive. So when you think, why is that child not saying anything? They probably don't have the words to use. That's something we do in our body safety, our good touch, bad touch. We give them the words. We make sure they understand proper body terminology so that when they do speak up, they use the right words, and then it's not going to be misunderstood. It's simply not going to be misunderstood. So I tell the story of the little girl that was telling her teacher every couple of days, I don't like it, but grandpa likes to touch my cookies, or he likes to taste my cookies. And the teacher was like, "Oh, you can share with grandpa the cookies. It's okay." Well, come to find out months later that the cookies were that little girl's private parts, and grandpa was molesting her. So, had that little girl told her teacher, "Grandpa likes to lick my vagina," that would not have been mistaken. So, it's important that we teach those kids that proper terminology so that if they are trying to just survive, at the point that they finally disclose, there's no mistaking the disclosure. This is from a victim who's been in long-term recovery. She's been out now she's been out of the system for probably 15 years. And she said, the worst part of this is that this is your family, and it's very hard to get away from them. You're constantly in that abusive environment. And whether you want to be or not, mentally, you're still tied to those people for the rest of your life. Now, when we remove a child from a situation like this, ideally, obviously, they should never be going back. And under our Illinois laws for family reunification, that's something that we really, really, really need to take that on an individual basis. These kids cannot go back into the home ever. There can be no contact. If we talk about moving them into a foster care situation, perhaps kinship care, moving to grandma's house or Aunt Susie's house, those family members need to be vetted, incredibly vetted, because of the natural tendency for this to be an intergenerational issue. That's a difficult place to be. If we put these kids in foster care, what do the foster parents do? I mean, these kids need specialized attachment disorder issues, they trauma counseling, very specialized, which is why kudos, kudos, kudos to the state of Illinois and DCFS for opening this new residential treatment facility for child trafficking victims, because our treatment facilities across the United States, very few of them will take a child under the age of 18. We have them for adults, especially adult women. We have them, but they have to be 18 or older. Thank heaven we now have children's placement for this here in Illinois. And my prayer is that that will spread southward and that we will have multiple treatment facilities in that space. But what do we do with these kids as they grow up? That's just something that is very difficult, and we're just now on the cusp of dealing with that. Some things to think about. Is this more common in rural areas? Yes, research is telling us that, because it's easier to hide. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in our urban areas, but in our rural areas, it's much easier to hide this, because you might have, if you've been in the hills and hollers of very, very southern Illinois, you know that there might not be a neighbor within 2 or 3 miles in some of our places, or the hills and the hollers keep it pretty well hidden. My young lady that I spoke about, my 12-year-old that her brother was trafficking her, they lived in what I call Clem and Billy Bubba territory in another state, where everybody in that state and that area is always packing. You always are packing a gun. That's just life in that area. So that's why I call it Clem and Billy Bubba territory. And I'm coining that lovingly because that's the territory that I'm from. But nobody saw anything. They lived in a kind of a grove of trees that was very secluded in a very rural area. Nobody saw these people coming and going. A younger child is not able to leave, flat out. It's not like a 15-year-old that might be able to get up and run or couch surf or hide. A younger child, a 4-year-old can't do that. A 2-year-old doesn't even know to do that. The grooming starts at such a young age, from the day they're born, that normalization makes this very difficult to detect because the kids don't talk about it. As I said just recently, our typical promo and education, our body safety education, is not addressing this specific type of abuse, and we need to work that into our curriculums. Family reunification in the state of Illinois is a wonderful, wonderful tool when it is used appropriately. In this scenario, it is not appropriate, and we need to advocate for that because it can get lost in the process. So just letting you know that when on the back end of things, or on the front end of back end of things, when those of you who are dealing with adults, we wonder why these folks started using drugs in the first place. Well, here we go. This is maybe one of the reasons that they were falling in. Trauma is the real gateway drug. It's not marijuana. And I'm so old. I am so old that cigarettes used to be considered a gateway drug. Oh my goodness, they were caught smoking cigarettes in sixth grade. They're going to be in prison by the time they're 18. They're going to be an addict. And I hate that word, but back then that's what they said. The point being is trauma is really the driving factor to reaching for those drugs, reaching for the alcohol, reaching for the marijuana to stem the tide of not only the emotional pain, but yes, in these cases, the physical pain. Again, it may be worth asking if you see some of these things lining up. Okay. What do you need to do if you suspect this? Well, I'm going to tell you, gather your information and document, document, document. Be specific. Keep a log of your concerns, the dates, the people involved, the incidents, what was said, what was not said. Be very, very, very specific. The more information you give, every little detail that you give allows DCFS something to work off of. So when you make that report to DCFS, you've given them everything. I tell people that when you get on that phone to make that hotline report, you should be on that phone for a solid 15 or 20 minutes telling them everything you know, if not longer. The reports, when I have made reports, the ones that get headed off at the pass the fastest are the ones that I have more detail to give. Okay. And if that report comes out unfounded, keep, keep, keep your log, keep documenting and make another report if you had to. My 3 little girls that I talked about at the very beginning that were given back to mom, still in the same daycare, it took 4 different reports before things were finally substantiated and the girls were dealt with in the way that it needed to be done. So please, please, I know that that's difficult and we get disappointed when things are unfounded, but understand on the backside of this that our caseworkers, our investigators are working in a very specific set of definitions that they have to use. So give them every tool you can. There's the DCFS hotline. How do we get to 100% happy, healthy families? We've got to understand these long-term needs of these kids and these kids that have now turned into adults. We have to put interventions in place So think that body safety class. Are we addressing things that we need to be addressing? Are we looking at the family as a whole? If drugs are a piece, how are we helping them? How do we intervene? In our community, we are just now in March, we will be launching our deflection initiative. Deflection is sort of the pre-situation before somebody is arrested. So law enforcement might get called to a situation and they see a problem, but they realize this isn't something I want to arrest for. If we can help these people, then maybe we don't have to fill up our jails. And so they call the deflection specialist, and the deflection specialist shows up and starts working through this stuff. This is one of those examples of appropriate and effective interventions. There is a lot of good being done with deflection initiatives across the state. And yesterday, actually across the United States, yesterday I had the privilege of saying just a few words to advocate for our children at the statewide deflection conference and bring up the fact that our specialists, our deflection specialists, need to understand what the needs of these children are when they stumble into this kind of thing or they get called into it. We also need to integrate. You guys have heard of ACEs. I'm not going into ACEs, the adverse childhood events I know, or experiences. I know you know that, but positive childhood experiences. And the reason is that, and that's what a positive childhood experience is. They can happen in and out of the home, doesn't matter. But we know that those positive childhood experiences can stem the tide of the long-term trauma. And the one that I want to hone in on here is this says two non-parent adults who care. I'm going to challenge that and say one adult, one safe adult that child has to go to. One safe adult. And what if that is you? What if that is you? What if you are the one that child finally discloses to or feels like they can tell you? Listen to what they're saying. Listen to what they're saying. Look at the check marked boxes here. Are there other things that we can put in that? When you're looking at adults, I will tell you, adults that have been traumatized by this, it's the same thing. It's just not a positive childhood experience. You may be the positive adulthood experience. You might be the one adult that they trust and that they're going to let you know that this happened to them, but you may have to explain what it is. This is has this happened to you? And if it has, then we can go upstream. We've gone upstream and we've found out why they fell in. Now let's treat the trauma. Let's treat the attachment issues. Let's treat all of those pieces and break the cycle. Break the cycle. Knowledge is not always behavior change. The goal is behavior change. And that means those of us who are on the helping side of things need to be maybe adjusting our conversations, listening to what's going on, being very cognizant of what's going on in that child's world, as well as possibly what an adult who's been through this might have gone through as a child. We need to think outside of the box. And when I work with my judicial folks, that's a tough sell, is to say, think outside of the box, because it adds work to your plate. But oftentimes that extra work is what's going to help that person. I leave this on here. I know it's cheesy, but when it comes to our children, they can't advocate for themselves. They simply can't do it. It is our job, and it's our job to be in the way. We are mandated reporters. We have to be looking for this, and we have to report it and report it again and again if necessary. We might be the only person that's in the way of this. So I'll leave that with you. Crazy kids, right? Those are three of my grandchildren. So I can put that picture up and I just think it's hysterical. But it's our job to be in the way. It's our job to keep them safe. There's my contact information. This is a training that I'm happy if you feel like your community, your organization, whatever needs to be done for your folks, all you have to do is reach out to me. and I will make sure it happens, whether we do it through a webinar, whether we do it in person, I can come to you. I will do whatever. I also speak at various conferences, so I will be at the Together for Youth conference at John A. Logan coming up, also the Closing the Gap conference coming up, Illinois Association of Problem Solving Courts in October. I can throw that out. I will also tell you, I don't think I've got it on here, but we do have an Illinois Drug-Endangered Children's Alliance. Both Nancy and I are on that. If you are interested in being a part of that, please reach out to one of us and we will hook you up gladly. I co-chair that with Prevent Child Abuse folks, and we deal with these topics. We have a conference coming up in May 12th. In Springfield, we've not released the registration for that, but if you're interested in that as a one-day conference in Springfield, we'd love to have you. Some of these things will be topics at that conference. And I'm done. Nancy, what did I miss? What else do we need to do here?
I need to get off of mute. I think you've covered it really well. I encourage people to take a look at the conference when things come out and watch for the save the date and the promotion because I think it's going to be a dynamite conference. And I can't think of anything else. Over and over again, people have been asking about the slides, and Liesl will be sending those to me. We will send those out to you. There were a couple of questions in here that probably need to be shared with you when we finish here. Just looking
Okay.
for resources and
Okay.
some direction.
Well, let me tell you, if you are on here, and I don't know how many people are on, I might be opening up all kinds of
You have
doors here.
134 still on here.
Okay, well, my email is there. I want you to use it. I want you to reach out to me. I know most of you need to get back to work, but if you just need somebody to brainstorm with you, if nothing else, please reach out to me. I am happy, happy, happy to do that. And I will answer you. I absolutely will answer you. And we'll probably get on the phone and start talking. So,
Yeah. Well, I just really am so appreciative of all the people that have joined us and to know that there's that much interest. It just makes me so happy that we've got such diversity because I think it's definitely, I've said for several years, it's time we get out of our silos and work together. And this shows it's starting to happen. So,
right.
anything else? Get a hold of us. Um, Either one of us, and Christina has been on the chat answering some things. So I think we're ready to go. And I just really thank you, Liesl. That was great.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It was
You
good to be here.
folks have a great lunch. Enjoy some of the warmer weather that may eventually get here, and keep looking to see what comes up next. Appreciate you all. Bye bye.